I very much like the idea of making things simple. You know, I don't like long-winded explanations and 500 different steps to getting things done. I like nice, simple solutions. The problem, I suppose, is that narcissistic abuse is not a simple subject. It's not hard, it's not so easy to understand what narcissism even is, where narcissistic abuse comes from, and it's not so easy to understand, therefore, how it manifests. But let's make it as simple as we can. Scusi. This is my Sam Backman impression. My name is Richard Grannon. I'm the author of Nothing. And instead of a mini, actually it is a mini. Hey, it's smaller than Sam's. This got Freudian real quick. So let's say that narcissistic abuse is a kind of oppression of the self. It's an attack to the self. I'm not in this video making oblique, veiled political points. So if you hear the term oppression, or you hear me say something that you think sounds like I'm talking about governments, actually on this one, I'm not. Let's just keep it to interpersonal, either parental or familial, or perhaps romantic, sort of the relationship context. So narcissistic abuse could be said to be an attack by one person, the narcissist, onto the victim. What are they attacking? Keeping this really, really simple. What are they attacking and how are they attacking it? I think we could say, if we're going to use the simplest terms possible, that the narcissist attacks the target's sense of self. They target the person's being. So how does that manifest in the long term? The narcissistic abuse, the cluster of symptoms that we could call narcissistic abuse victim syndrome, or whatever you want to call it, sometimes it overlaps neatly with the main descriptions of CPTSD. Sometimes not so much. Sometimes it can be a little awkward, and we're sort of forcing square pegs into round holes. So in narcissistic abuse, the cluster of symptoms you'll notice are, good English, grammar, please, are focused around the target sense of self. Their perceptions of reality and their perception of who they are. How does this play out? Well, I suppose that it plays out by attacking the very structure by which we form a sense of self. And the very structure by which we form a sense of self is through language, is through linguistics. It's almost impossible to have a self-concept without an internal dialogue running. And that internal dialogue will typically be either in your primary language, the language that you were raised in, or the language that you use mostly day to day. I'm always interested to speak to people who are truly bilingual. I'm not truly bilingual. I can have a go in different languages, but I'm not truly bilingual. There's people who are. I'm always like, do you dream in the foreign language? Do you think in the foreign language? Do you count? So some people be like, oh, I count in the secondary language, but I think in my first language, or I do driving in the foreign language, or so on. But it's linguistics. So there's language and then concept. I'm really going to avoid making this like a philosophical video. We'll keep it simple, we'll keep it practical, we'll keep it psychological. But I think there are some things that we can't avoid. Our sense of self is rooted in language. It's very, as soon as we say, who are you? How are you? Where are you? Well, that's language to form the question. And how you respond is going to come through language. Language pointing at concepts. What are those concepts made up of? Well, those concepts of where you are, who you are, how you're doing, what you had for breakfast today, they are also, the fabric of the concepts is linguistic as well. Interesting then to note that the narcissist's major weapons are words. And perhaps, you might find a correlation between narcissism and wordsmithery. I don't know. I've always claimed that there's been a high correlation between one of my favorite performance art modalities, which is stand-up comedy. I think most stand-up comedians, if they're very effective, are high for narcissistic traits. And to use the CPTSD language, they're high for fight fawn. When you deliver a good set, you're kind of delivering an attack on the audience to derive a reaction, to derive an emotional response, to get that mirth. And a lot of it is rooted in anger. The good stand-up comic appeals frequently to the audience's own anger and frustration. And that's what can get the biggest laugh sometimes. But perhaps also, and obviously stand-up comedy is nothing but words. If it's good, you do have hacky stand-up comics who try and do it through silly faces and jumping up and down and waving their arms around. But the best stand-up comics are just using words. So narcissistic abuse made simple. The narcissist uses words and language skillfully to attack the target's sense of self. The target's sense of self is constructed from language, from words, and from concepts. And those concepts, I am claiming here, are also constructed of language. Because if I say to you, oh yeah, let's do the political thing. You know, which way do you lean politically, and who do you support? You answer whichever way you're answering. And I then want to ask you a further question, which would be like, well, what's your stance on economics? What's your stance on education? What's your stance on foreign policy? These external concepts, which are forming the cluster of your political leaning, are all made of language. So when advice is offered, and people say to me, what should I do to cope with a narcissistic boss, my narcissistic ex-wife, my narcissistic even siblings, children, whatever it is. And the advice is handed back. And I think actually this is Sam's concept. The term coined is no contact. Okay, so to use a metaphor, if you're asking the question, I'm being exposed to a virus and I become symptomatic when I experience a greater viral load. So the more exposure to the virus I get, the worse my symptoms are and the sicker I become. What would the good doctor recommend? Stay away from the virus. Get a smaller viral load. Avoid the virus. Again, to use a different metaphor, if you're saying, if I go to this place and connect with this person, what comes through is a kind of viral loaded language, a poisonous, toxic language that I then imbibe, and it makes me feel very sick. It actually does deep damage to my system. You would be told, diminish contact, or preferentially, totally go completely no contact. And I think that idea, sometimes when I'm looking around online, I see that sort of upsets people, or it can confuse people and go, well, what does that mean? Or I'll have people say to me, I went no contact with my ex-boyfriend, but he won't stop texting me. And I'll say to them, well, you didn't really go no contact if you didn't block his number. You didn't go no contact. You might be low contact or diminished contact. Why? So why do we do it? Very simple. Very, very simple. Any and all communication from that person is an opportunity for abuse. They're using it to abuse me. And so I must reduce their power by being in less contact with them, or preferentially in no contact at all. Yes, allow me to preempt the rebuttal to that, which is sometimes we have to be in contact with these people. Yes, you do. We do. Some of you, poor souls, are in shared custody situations with people who are very, very sick. And you have my sympathy, you have my compassion, but perhaps you don't have my empathy. I recently read a piece on the BBC from sort of BBC News that was saying how actually it was based on recent scientific research that said that actually empathy itself can lead to violence and rage. which will not please our professional empaths out there. And the research, the paper published, indicated that actually what was better was kindness and compassion, which is a little cooler, a little more distant. I don't need to feel your feels for you. So at that point, you would be saying, okay, can I diminish? Let's just give you a very, very simple piece of advice. Let's go external and internal. Can I diminish the amount of words per day that I can hear or read from this person? If yes, go diminish them. If no, they're your boss, they're your spouse, you're in some sort of a relationship where you just can't avoid them, then we can switch. We have little agency externally. And then you have another problem in your life, by the way, because if you don't have the agency to avoid somebody talking to you, you have a bigger problem in your life than that person, which is there's no agency in your life. You're trapped in a power dynamic that really isn't good. You're living life as though you were in a prison. So please don't be blind to the power dynamics. Psychology is often blind to just simple power dynamics. Don't be blind to that. Do you need to make more money? Do you need to physically escape somehow? You know, some of you, maybe really young people, would be like, well, I can't. I don't have credit cards. I'm not allowed legally to just bugger off and leave. Okay, well, so then we move to the internal modality, which is we say, okay, I can't avoid their words. I can't avoid hearing them, and I can't avoid reading their words, which would be the preferred mode, or having the ultimate preferred mode is zero contact, no contact at all. Secondary preference would be diminished contact or reduced capacity for their words to reach you. And then we start to move into backup plans, far less desirable options, but at least it's something. Can you protect yourself at the internal level? So your boss is going to show up at 9 o'clock in the morning and be rude and snotty and say something abusive and unpleasant to you. And it takes them 15 words to do that straight away. Typically, normally, up until that point, historically, that's dropped you into an altered emotional state that's not been a very pleasant emotional state for you to be in. Can we start? Is there an option to create a discretionary gap, a discretionary boundary within ourselves between what that person says and what we feel? Can we start to go no contact with the internal dialogue of what that person is saying? And what I mean by this is by creating a space between what is said and being detached from what is being done at the internal level would be to look and to listen and to observe and say, this is what this person just said, and this is what I feel about it. If I increase the gap between the two, is it possible for them to say what they're saying and for it to affect me less? Not at all. Not at all. That's an unreasonable demand. But for it to affect me less. If yes, what would it take for me to be less affected by this person's words? Go inside your own mind and answer that question for yourselves if you want to come up with really good, nuanced answers that are individualized to suit your needs and your experience. Now that you've all done that, diligently and with great self-discipline and personal agency, I could offer you a little piece of advice on that, which would be, it might be time to say, okay, I could say to myself something like, I am me, you are you, we are two separate entities. Your life is your life, my life is my life. Right now, at this point in the timeline of my history, of my story, I'm in a weak power dynamic. This isn't how I'm going to live my life. I'll never let this happen to myself again. But right now, I have to be here present with this person. So I can't switch off my ears. My ears are still going to register the sound waves, and my brain is still going to decode the nonsense that's spewing out their mouths. But I can choose to detach from it and say, listen, I'm not going to take this individual all that seriously. And I'm not going to take what they're saying all that seriously. You could do what is called a reframe. You could see that person as a little robot, a little toy wind-up robot. And it does what it does, and it says what it says thoughtlessly. It does what it does, and it says what it says with very little intent. and very little consciousness there. And it just sort of rattles along. It's very unimaginative. It's very uncreative. It's very non-spontaneous. And that the recordings that it plays and spews out of its little speaker mouth, they're not actually really about you. They're about the fact that that little robot doesn't have ego boundaries, and it's got a very pronounced superego, which has created a very toxic outer critic. So because of the robots, this poor little tin robot's desperate feelings of insecurity, desperate feelings of inferiority, it's making continuous machine-like neurotic compensatory gestures by criticizing everybody in the environment. If you're wrong and 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 you're wrong, I'm not wrong. And you might say, well, hang on a second, that doesn't make sense. That's not logical. That's not rational, nor is it true. Philosophically, that's a weak position. Just making everybody else wrong doesn't automatically make you right. And I would agree with you. I would say, yes, that's right. Pity the robot and view the robot from a distance and just say, okay, this is what it does, not just to me, but to everybody. And to the extent that this machine is broken, it's now broken to only move in one direction and it can't change that direction. It is weaker than me because I do have agency and I do have the ability to respond as a fully conscious, present, adult human being. They do not. They are weaker than me, generally, outside of this system, whatever your system is. It could be a household, it could be a bank you work at, it could be a hotel you're working in, it could be a relationship you're involved in, it could be shared custody. Outside that system, they're very fragile. They're very weak because, well, they don't function. They don't function in the world well. What they do is they parasitically attach themselves to systems. See, in psychology, we think about individuals. I would, without wanting to make this video complicated, I would suggest that psychology itself as a study kind of has narcissism built into it, in that it is individualistically focused. And we're not really individuals. The idea of an individual from a scientific, it might be useful from a philosophical point of view, from a historical point of view, from a political point of view. Yes, but at a scientific point of view, and when you're being ultra rational, which you must be in this scenario, be very rational, be very analytical, be very clinical, gather the data and look and say, what is happening here? We're in a system. From a systems thinking point of view, there aren't really individuals. There are just systems. Psychology encourages us to think of ourselves as individuals and others as individuals. And I believe it is a mistake. It can lead to a lot of wasted time spent. So we tend to think and talk of narcissistic abuse as taking place between two people, and that narcissists are kind of parasitical, vampire type creatures who attach to a person. Actually, they attach to systems. They're not really interested in people. They're interested in narcissistic supply and benefits, narcissistic supply and power, narcissistic supply and that which makes them feel good. The individual, in the naive psychological sense, doesn't actually really have the power to deliver an awful lot of that. All the individual can offer is narcissistic supply. An individual can't offer you access to government grants, can't access you, I don't know, access to fame, celebrity, can't get you on the radio, can't get you on TV, can't get you in a movie. And you might be watching this going, yeah, they can, because they have power. And I would say yes, and that's the mistake. You think the individual has power, but actually the system the individual is tied into has power. If I'm going to make a phone call and say I'm going to get you on Prague's national, or the Czech Republic's main national TV station, you would say, oh, Richard has the power to do that. Well, I don't, not without my phone and not without the contact that I have, and not unless the person I'm bringing in has, they're systems. These are all systems of power. These are systems of agency, if you like. These are systems in which things get done. So the narcissist is actually attaching themselves to systems. and you really, outside of just basic, what does Sam say? Supply, sex, and services. So you offer supply as an individual. Absolutely, you can. But it's always better to get more supply from more people than from just one. You offer services as an individual. Absolutely. But it's always better to get services from more people and from the people you're in contact with. And even, sex, which, okay, so yeah, that's something that you can offer as an individual. But actually, the attachment is typically to systems. When you think of it in this way, which is not, I'm not offering anything radical here, I'm keeping it simple. It just allows you to have a little bit of perceptual flexibility. And therefore, because you have perceptual flexibility, behavioral flexibility in how you think, feel, and act when you're faced with a narcissistically abusive person. Because if you sort of stay within, let's say you have a timeline, and you as an individual, you've gotten into a narcissistically abusive relationship, and then you move through time, and the narcissistically abusive relationship plays out, and you're either trying to escape or you have escaped, but you feel like crap afterwards. Whatever the thoughts, words, deeds, the cognitions, the emotions, and the actions you took that your personality, your individual system structure caused you to play out again and again, if you want to recover, you must see that all of that has to stop. Not all of it, but a lot of it must be changed. The way you typically think, the way you typically feel, the way you typically act, your habitual patterns of behavior on a daily basis need to change. Even if you're not with the person anymore and you're just in the recovery phase, change is what is going to help you to recover as quickly as possible. Okay, I think I spoke enough about that on this subject for today. If anybody has any questions, please write them now. If you could make the questions one sentence long and end in a question mark, I shall try and get to them. You'll notice that my cup is disposable because once I've used it, I just cast it aside. I faithfully attach to nothing. There's no loyalty here. What are your thoughts on attachment theory? I think that here's my thoughts on attachment theory. Wouldn't be very popular. Any adult who wants love, which is the same thing as saying any adult, needs to have at least a rudimentary understanding of attachment theory, and they need to have at least a rudimentary half an hour conversation about potential attachment trauma and attachment styles if they want relationships to work. I think the fantasy that we're raised with, that one person meets another person and that person is the one and then they just go off into the sunset happily ever after, really needs to be called out as a fantasy. And when we have problems in relationships and we want to resolve them so that we can create long-term lasting safe attachment, we really do need to have some kind of an understanding of attachment theory. And it's not that hard to wrap your head around. So how do you manage contact with a narcissist when they're family and you're reliant on them in an unhealthy way? Make it a priority to not be reliant on them in this unhealthy way. Forget everything to do with narcissism and psychology and only focus on getting yourself out of that unhealthy attachment. How does one go no contact with one parent when both parents are together when visiting? You cannot. You cannot go no contact with one parent if they're together when visiting. It's not possible. You would have to be no contact with both of them or in contact with both of them if they're visiting you. Okay. What's your take on the acquisition of narcissistic fleas from a narcissistic parent? Yeah, narcissism does seem to function a little bit like a virus. I mean, by definition, And, you know, I don't hide it. Like I go with the DSM definition. By definition of the council of 22 people who wrote the DSM-5, it must be maladaptive, which means it has to hurt the person who has the personality disorder. It needs to affect their lives negatively in order for it to be NPD. But there's no doubt that behaving narcissistically in the world has advantages. And so if you're, from a certain point of view, from a certain very limited amoral point of view, so if you're being raised by somebody who's highly narcissistic, the chances of you not catching some of their dirty little habits are minimal. They're minimal. I mean, apart from anything else, children model adults no matter what they do. Good question. Thank you for that. Whoa. You don't need to send me money, guys. I appreciate it, but it is not necessary. Joseph Elias, at 34, I'm now rebuilding my life after chronic long-term neglect, abuse caused by mother and grandmother. Any tips for being a better man? Naivety, assertiveness? Yeah, I mean, one of the main things I wanted to convey in this video is, like, if we look at narcissistic abuse, whether it's parental, familial, in the workplace, in a relationship, it's when one person damages the other person's sense of self and affects them, their sense of self, and oppresses them. One person, the narcissist, is oppressing the target's sense of who they are and how they function in the world. And so the damage that does, I mean, if it goes on for years or it's in a family relationship, what you end up with, I don't think it's a wild claim, is a damaged self. Like, your self doesn't work very well anymore. Why? Well, because people have been picking at it for years. And anytime you tried to set a boundary or be assertive, you would have been attacked for that. And that wall that you were desperately trying to build would have been kicked down. So I do have a course for dealing with this. It's called Summoning the Self. It's not an easy course, but the feedback I've had from it so far is that people really love it. They're enjoying it. They're getting benefit from it. But it's a little bit hard. So I'd recommend trying that course, seeing if you like it. If you don't, it's too hard, it's not for you, you just let us know, we'll do your refund. It takes 30 days. It's set up as a 30-day course to complete it, but you will be working with these techniques and concepts and exercises offered in the course. You should expect to be working with them for some time, and it wouldn't be less than a year. Rebuilding the damaged sense of self from a narcissistic mother and grandmother, these are, I can only imagine the damage that's done to you as a man, the damage that's done to your view of women, to your capacity to have intimate relationships. I imagine that's very, very tough. So it will take time. It definitely will take time. But that's what I would recommend you do, because your self has been damaged. Rebuilding the self, strengthening the self, thriving, moving forward would be my advice. Okay, if I don't get to you guys, I do apologize. How can I determine if the female therapist I'm seeing is narcissistic, or if my negative response is to do with attachment trauma, mother wounds? With reason, with clarity, try to be rational, try to be clinical, figure out what has been said between you. If you feel like your reality, your dignity, your sense of self is being negated by the therapist, then you don't need to declare that she's a narcissist, but you can certainly say she's a bad therapist who's not doing her job, and you can drop her for that reason. Let's see. MD asks, is revenge wrong? Well, I'm not a priest, so I can't and I don't have a religious ideology to sort of filter that question through. But it is an interesting one. is it wrong? It's natural. The desire to take revenge is natural. It exists in the world. I would need to know what your framework for right or wrong is. The one that I loosely use is it life affirming? Would it lead to truth, to justice, and to the fullest expression of what a person or a thing is supposed to be? I see these things as good. Evil would be that which opposes growth, expression, truth, and justice. So is revenge wrong by that paradigm? It certainly could become very wrong very, very quickly, because your revenge might not be my revenge. And we would need to know, like, what is that revenge going to look like? Vengeance itself, I think, probably is coming from a level of consciousness that is rooted in a desire to simply strike back, to engage in a tit for tat sort of talionic punishment modality, and not to sound like a fucking highfalutin twerp doing an impression of Gandhi. I don't really see how that can lead to improvement. I don't see how that can lead anywhere good. If we all took revenge on each other based on historical crimes, attempting to redress that balance, the world would descend into chaos. The world has descended into chaos. The world could descend into chaos on that basis. Revenge can only take place by definition based on a historical grievance, whether it was done yesterday or whether it was done 500 years ago. I'm not a historian, but I read about history now, usually when I have insomnia and can't sleep at night, and I just get an idea in my head, I want to look at something. I've never seen violence initiated as a result of a historical grievance that ended well, or that seemed to bring justice to the world, or that seemed to make the world a better place. And I've looked so many times into it that I would even say that it seems written into the source code of this reality that if you try to seek vengeance for a historical grievance, things go badly, because we are mere mortals. We don't know what justice is. Bringing it back to the systems thinking that I mentioned earlier, if you look at everything in individualistic terms, you're kind of stuck with narcissism, because the individual by definition is narcissistic, not a narcissist. Those are two. When we say that person is a narcissist, we mean they have NPD. But to be narcissistic is to be human. I mean, we are self-centered, we are solipsistic, we are subjective, we attempt to be better, but sometimes the flesh vehicle wins and we're drawn downward. And when the flesh vehicle dictates what we're doing and what we're thinking, we're narcissistic. So, you know, you have a concept like justice, and I started thinking about justice as a great way of, this is not the way to combat insomnia, by the way, folks. If you get your brain going more, it's just going to keep, you're just going to stay awake. And then I started thinking about justice, and on the basis of wars and violence initiated on the basis of historical grievance. And I came to the conclusion that there's really no such thing as justice. And it's an impossible ideal. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for it. We should strive for love. We should strive for justice. We should strive for fairness. But we shouldn't do it naively. We should do it with a sense of tragedy, with a sense of humility, that we are fallible, that none of us really knows what justice is. You know, you think of any scenario that's taken place, it's like some scenario from biblical myth. People being put before a great king and told, this brother cut off the hand of this brother for touching his wife. Should we cut off both of his hands, one of his hands, gouge out one of his hands? You know, like what should we do? And it's very hard to know. In fact, sorry, it's not very hard. It's actually impossible to know. So then you look at like the criminal justice system that we live in the modern world from that philosophical perspective. And you think, my God, what a mess. But of course it is. I mean, what's it trying to do? Is it there to deliver vengeance? And you would say, no, it's not. It is. It is. I mean, it's not just there to protect civilians. That's perfectly clear. It's there to inflict vengeance on people that massive, lumbering, dumb, blind bureaucracy have deemed to be guilty. And I would say it's an almost impossible task. I would want nothing to do with it. I don't know what would happen if I was called for jury duty, because I know it can't work. And I say that sitting here in Prague, knowing that Kafka wrote about this. It was like a recurrent theme in his books, is that there isn't really justice in the world. Let him without sin cast the first stone. I read another Bible quote this morning, because I sit around in the morning reading Bible quotes. No, there's a reason for it. It was from John, and it said, anybody who says they are without sin has deceived themselves. And I think that's true. So it's very tricky. Is revenge wrong? Revenge is dangerous. A very, very dangerous game. I went off there. Let me come back. It's the LSD in my coffee or what? Can a whole country show the signs of narcissistic abuse top down? Yes, can and does. There's been published papers on it. There's a published paper, very rude, that's called, it's the funniest name for a published paper I've ever seen. I'm pretty sure it's called Russia is a Borderline. And then it goes into the description. It's from a while ago. It's not recent. A description of why the whole of the country of Russia, or its government, behaves like it has a borderline personality disorder. Pretty rude. So yeah, you can have group psychosis. You can have national psychosis. You can have a nation of people who are absolutely traumatized in a similar way because they're living through similar historical contexts. Again, you say in the Czech Republic, not that long ago, that full-blown communism was kicked out. It was still here in the late 80s, and you can see an effect on the people here. There's a certain direction, there's a certain mode of being that's absolutely, at least partly related to that, totalitarianism. Darling Smith, how to avoid narcissistic injury with my success healing. Better I do, the worse he gets. I don't know what your relationship dynamic is, but you should really be seeking to diminish contact to zero if possible. And yes, any sign that you're recovering, that you are resummoning the self, bringing the self back, fortifying the self, starting to thrive and move on, will indeed cause narcissistic injury. Okay, folks, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. I do hope that was useful. If it was, please hit the like button, subscribe, dance, sing, and twirl around nude, if it pleases you. Thank you, and I'll speak to you soon.